Thank you so much for the invitation. It's good to be here and with you. I've been asked to speak for, I think, about 20 minutes. So what I'm going to say is we could say something of a personal history. I may not be able to cover everything, and probably by uh, design, I'm not going to try and cover everything. But of course, if people have questions about anything I'm about to say, then please feel free to ask them. Um, the challenge of teaching is, you could say, both a personal and a political challenge. But as I say, I'm going to outline some of those things which have challenged me over the years, and then maybe say something about the teaching itself. I perhaps should explain that although I ended up as a professor of history, my original aim was to become a school teacher, and I set out on that aim a long time ago in the 1970s. At that time, some of you, I don't think there's anybody probably old enough to remember the 1970s because all the faces I'm seeing look so youthful. But at that time, some of you may remember there was the idea that the history of Africa and also the history of the Caribbean, so we can say of the diaspora, was something that should be taught in schools. And there were various reasons for those efforts. Um, so when I was still a young teenager, I got to hear about some of those efforts. And because of my own experiences growing up here in Britain, one of the things which I missed, which I didn't have, was any teaching about Africa or Africans at school or anywhere else for that matter. And so I decided at a very young age that it was something that I wanted to learn about. I was probably about 13 or 14 when I began investigating this history for myself. So I decided, because of my own interest and because there were these kind of rumblings that this history should be taught in schools, I decided I would become a school teacher, a history teacher in school. And so the first challenge, you could say, was to actually achieve that aim, which was not as easy as it might appear. The first step was to, in my case, was to study African history at university, and I won't go into all of that because that presented its own challenges. Because at that time and still today, the history of Africa at university, there are very few universities that taught African history in those days. I think only three at that time, but it was taught from a very kind of Eurocentric perspective that I won't go into any further at this point. So that was the first challenge. Anyway, I succeeded in that challenge, you could say, in the sense that I managed to get a degree in the history in African history, and I was then actually encouraged to carry on my research, and actually to do a PhD. Which, looking back on it, was a very strange thing. I didn't know anybody who did a PhD, had a PhD, or anything about PhDs. Anyway, I started on a PhD, and for various reasons that, again, because of time, I won't go into now, I didn't complete that PhD. I decided this is all complete waste of time, and I should carry on with my aim to become a school teacher and to teach young people the history of Africa and so on. So I applied to two teacher training colleges, both of them in London, and I was rejected by both of them, even though I had quite a good degree. um, so essentially, that finished my career as a school teacher. And then, to cut a long story short, I began trying to teach the history of Africa elsewhere, at adult education level, at further education level, and so on, various attempts. And that was also very difficult to do because there weren't many opportunities to do that at that time. And so I was encouraged, I was essentially told that if I wanted to teach the history of Africa and so on, I would need to do a PhD. So I went back and did another PhD for about 7 years. And then, anyway, again, cutting a long story short, eventually received a PhD and began to look for employment at university level. So that has its own challenges. But I managed to find a job. In fact, I think I was one of the first people ever to be employed, not just to teach the history of Africa, but also to teach what was then called, or was then referred to as, Black British history. And so throughout my career, I've always tried to combine the history of Africa with the history of the African diaspora. I don't see that there should necessarily be a distinction between them. I'm concerned with the history of Africans. Whether those Africans happen to be in the African continent or somewhere else is not, I won't say it's irrelevant, but there's a connection between those histories. And to separate one from the other always seemed to me a bit artificial. So anyway, I began my academic career, I think, in 1995 at Middlesex University. And again, there are various challenges in regard to establishing the teaching of Africa and the African diaspora anywhere, but particularly in universities which don't specialize in that subject. And I won't go into all of them now because it will take too long, but it is, or was, quite difficult. And that, I stayed at Middlesex University for 15 years. And the culmination of that, during the time I was there, we had what was then called a minor award, basically half a degree in something that was called race and culture at that time, but it was a kind of Black studies course. The university closed that down after a few years, and then they closed the whole history department down. So the main challenge, leaving aside various other academic problems, the main challenge of teaching the history of Africa and the diaspora at university level, in my experience, is actually being able to remain in your job for any length of time, or being able to sustain a course, or any particular course you want to teach. It's extremely difficult to do that. The Eurocentrism which exists is incredible, and all kinds of excuses are given as to why it's not possible. And I'll say a bit more about that as I talk about my second employer, which is the University of Chichester. So at the University of Chichester, when I left Middlesex University, I was unemployed for 2 years. And I can't remember what I did exactly. I think I was writing a book, and I'll say a bit more about publishing later because that has its own challenges. So at the University of Chichester, I also taught the history of Africa and the African diaspora. But it was during that time that I became aware, but became publicly obvious that there was a problem in this country with the teaching of Africa and the African diaspora. And that problem manifested itself in a headline in the Times educational supplement, which carried an article which said that only 3 Black people in the previous year, this would have been 2013, only 3 Black people were trained as history teachers in Britain. Now, I don't know exactly how many history teachers there are in Britain. I think it's something like 60,000, something like that. So this article pointed out that the previous year only 3 of those 60,000 were people of African or Caribbean heritage. And in fact, if you look into the figures, I don't know what the current figures are, but at that time, 2013, 2014, there were roughly, of those 60,000, I think I'm right saying it was 60,000, there was something like 300 were people of African and Caribbean heritage. So when I and others saw that headline, we decided that something should be done, and we were rather surprised that nobody else was doing anything about this issue, because it turns out that not only were there very few people being trained as teachers, which was what I'd originally wanted to do, but in fact there were very few young people or people of any age studying history at universities in this country. And in fact, if you look into the whole education system, GCSE level, A level, and so on, very few people of African or Caribbean heritage study history. In fact, at that time, it was the 3rd most unpopular subject amongst Black students in Britain. Only agriculture and veterinary science were more unpopular than history as a subject choice. So this was quite an amazing revelation if you actually think about how the communities, those of African, those of Caribbean heritage, regard history, how popular it is, how many people are interested in it, how many projects, how many lectures, how many, and so on there are about history. To think that out of all that, hardly anybody actually studies the subject is and was, actually quite shocking. And then the fact that nobody's concerned about it was even more shocking. So anyway, we decided to call a conference, which we called the History Matters Conference, which was held in 2015 in London. And a large number of people came to that conference. I think over 100 people attended. Most of the speakers at that conference were students at school or university, some teachers, a few, to discuss why there were so few young people in particular studying history, young people of African and Caribbean heritage, or people of African and Caribbean heritage in general studying history in this country. And the answer wasn't very difficult to find. Everybody who spoke said more or less the same thing. And that was that the teaching of history in this country is very Eurocentric. When people go to school, they don't learn anything about Africa or the Caribbean, or for that matter, people of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain. They might be subjected to sometimes what seemed to be almost years of focus on human trafficking across the Atlantic historically and so on, but they don't hear about anything else. As a consequence, or if they're lucky, you could say, to put it in that form, generally people don't hear anything about anybody who's like them or like their families. And so as a result, young people don't study history. They go and study other things. And there are some other reasons, but that was certainly the main reason. And so as a consequence of that information, the conference discussed, okay, what should we do about this issue? And various recommendations came up. And one of those recommendations was to create a project for young people, to encourage young people to engage with history. And we, as a result, set up the Young Historians Project in 2015, which involved some of those young Black people who had spoken at the conference. And they establish their own projects, their own research projects, and then have to present that research to their peers. So that could be through exhibitions, it could be through film, it could be through a variety of means. That project is still going on 10 years, 11 years later. You can all go to the website, younghistoriansproject.org, and you'll see what it does. One of the other recommendations was to set up a training program for mature students, people who loved history, but had been unable for one reason or another to pursue their love of history, but would like some training as to how they could be historians and carry out their own research. So in order to achieve that, we set up the Masters by Research program at the University of Chichester, which was specifically designed for mature students of African and Caribbean heritage. And some of you may know the history of that master's program, which ran for 5 years, was very successful. Many of the students went on to actually to do PhDs at the University of Chichester. In fact, we had the biggest cohort of Black postgraduate history students in Britain. I can't remember how many we had now. Anyway, about 15 or 16 students and so on. And then in 2023, the university decided to close that master's program and to make me redundant and to make my post redundant, I should say, and then left both the master's students and the PhD students that I supervised. I was about a dozen PhD students at that time, to leave them without supervision. So that was, anyway, a significant challenge, because it highlights the difficulty of actually teaching this subject at university level in this country. And that problem is unresolved because despite we can say a campaign and so on, various petitions and letters and so on, that situation hasn't altered. And it highlights one of the biggest problems, which is that universities are not really answerable to anybody, or they're answerable to those who finance them, which tends to be, anyway, government to some extent, big business, significantly as well. But they're not answerable to those who work in them, or those who study in them, or to the communities they serve and so on. So that was a significant challenge, remains a significant challenge. I saw just today that the Black Studies master's program at Birmingham City University is now also under threat. And it's those who teach on it. And as you will be familiar, there have been similar problems at Goldsmiths and elsewhere. So those are significant challenges which have yet to be overcome, but they're not the only challenges which we face, because one of the other ways in which, I mean, there are obviously, as I explained with the Young Historians Project, there are various ways of teaching. Being at a university isn't the only one. And in fact, in my time, I've taught in schools, further education, adult education, museums, online, in prisons. I ran an African history course in Broadmoor, actually a long time ago now. So it's not that I kind of only have taught in higher education, but in all of these circumstances, it's usually very challenging to present these courses, or to remain in post long enough to develop them, establish them, continue them, and so on. The other way in which we teach traditionally, or try to teach, is through writing, through publishing. And I know Margaret's listening somewhere, so I'll try and be careful what I say. But publishing books is a very difficult thing to do. It has its own challenges. And I'm only going to give one example because the examples are legion, and because I don't want to speak for too long. But I'm quite proud of the fact that I've written 3 history books for children, because obviously teaching is not just about teaching adults, but also about teaching children. And I'm very aware of the fact that as a young person growing up here, I didn't have those books. So I read a lot of history books. I didn't have any history books that were about Africa or about Africans. So I'm always trying to write for kids. But it's always a struggle. It's always a challenge. You have to almost literally fight with publishers to publish anything about Africans and so on. So just to give one example, I've actually got the book here. A long time ago, I published, or had published, this book. This was actually published, this is a history of African and Caribbean communities in Britain. It was first published in 1995, which is a very long time ago. And it was published, it came out of a suggestion that I made to the publisher. I'd written another book for them. So I said, oh, you should have a book on African and Caribbean people in Britain. So anyway, I managed to persuade them. Now, the way that publishers work is that they don't actually print very many books. I don't even know what the actual financial model is. But anyway, books don't hang around for very long. I don't know how many thousand copies they publish. So in other words, once the book has run out, once the print copies have disappeared, that's it. The book's disappeared. And so you would say to a publisher, particularly on a history like this, which is continually relevant, well, then you should republish the book. And when I suggested to the publisher they should republish this book, they said, well, there's no market for it. There's anyway, this went on for some years. In the end, I said, well, look, the only people who say there's no market for the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain are actually racists. So the publishers got very upset with me and said that I was accusing them of being racist. I said, well, I wasn't accusing you specifically, but that is an argument that racists use. Anyway, this went on for some time. The book was eventually republished, but with very bad grace by the publisher, who I won't mention who the publisher is for the time being. Then what happened was that then it went out of print again. And then we came to 2020, and you remember 2020, Black Lives Matter, and so on, so on. And various institutions in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests made statements to the effect that they would get anti-racist or whatever it was. Anyway, this particular publisher published a statement saying not only that they were anti-racist, but that they loved Black history, and even more than loving Black history, they loved Black authors and so on. So when I saw this statement, I was so angry. I did something that I've never done before. I made a video and I put it on Facebook. And I said, this is what this publisher is saying, and it's complete rubbish. And this is my experience, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the publisher saw this and wrote to me and said, oh, what seems to be the problem, and so on. And a meeting was held. And as a consequence of that, the book was published again. It came out looking like this. It was published again in 2023 or something like that, 2022 and so on. But anyway, I tell that story just to illustrate a very simple point, that even to produce a book for children is a very, very long and hard struggle. And that's just with one particular publisher. And so there are many, many difficulties in trying to present a history. And these are histories which everybody should be aware of. It's not just that these books should be available for young people of African or Caribbean heritage, but they should be available for everybody. And this is also true with history and how history is taught in schools or in universities, which is another struggle that one could talk about. How to change the national curriculum, how to make sure the history of everybody is taught. It's a history which everybody needs to know about. When I first joined the University of Chichester in 2012, I think, something like that, I taught a course called Africa and the Diaspora in the Modern World, which was essentially a history of Africa and the diaspora from 1500 to, anyway, the last 500 years of history. And that course was taught to first year undergraduate students. I would say probably 100% of them were English, white, and they'd never come across this history before. We did a little bit about human trafficking. We did something about the history of Africa, the history of the Caribbean. We did a little bit of African American history and a little bit of Black British history. So that class, I think I had 60 students in that class. It was my first semester at the university. And the students voted that course, module of the year, course of the year, which is not a compliment to me particularly. It was the fact that they'd never come across this history before. And they said, isn't it great? Isn't it great that we understand this about Africa, about the Caribbean, about the US, about Britain, about slavery, about whatever, how these things are connected, how they're important in understanding the modern world and so on, the world of the capital-centered world in which we live and so on. So these are vital for the understanding of young people, all people, about the world we live in. But unfortunately, there are very great challenges in presenting these histories, teaching these histories, establishing courses and mechanisms through which people can learn and understand about these histories. So that is briefly what I wanted to say. There are probably many other things that could be said about these challenges or particular aspects of these challenges. But I think that's probably a useful introduction. And as I said at the beginning, if people have queries or questions, then I'm happy to try and answer them. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. I didn't really give you the introduction that was necessary about your academics, etc. I didn't really want to lead you in that direction. I wanted you to tell us more about you and the struggles you had, which is what you have just done. The thing is, Professor, that I was educated here in England, and around about the same time as you were, I suppose. But I really hated history because I couldn't identify with what was being said. You know, it's not till in later life when I started to read books by Richard Hart and etc. And I began to see, well, wait, this is a fascinating subject. And now I can say I'm a armchair historian. Who really now how with the British education society refusing to change the curriculum to reflect more the part that Africa plays. You know, uh, what else can we do? What can we do to get them to do this?
Well, it's like everything else in life. We have to organize ourselves to change things. I mean, the national curriculum has changed over the years. It's probably more inclusive now than it was 50 years ago, but it changes and moves around depending on which government is in power and how much pressure is brought to bear on the education system, teachers, and so on. You probably remember that when Michael Gove was education secretary a few years ago, he tried to completely change the national curriculum so it was only about the white men of property. It didn't include anything about women or about people from Africa or the Caribbean and so on and so forth. So it's a continual battle to, I think, all of us as whether we're parents or grandparents or teachers or whatever, we have a responsibility to try and make sure that the situation's changed. But it's important not just in schools, in universities, in museums, in archives, in libraries, we all probably have a local library, or we may be fortunate enough to have a local library. Wherever we are, we need to make sure that the representation of history is accurate, that there are adequate books, that there are that museum displays also represent history accurately, that the media, that in TV, in wherever, it's a continuing struggle. And as I said, it's a struggle in which everyone needs to be involved. I usually like to give the example of what I consider the greatest political event in Britain's history, or the largest, or the most, yes, we can say the largest or greatest political event in Britain's history, which was the struggle against human trafficking in the 18th century. So that struggle against human trafficking was probably the first modern mass political struggle. It involved workers, it involved women, it involved Africans, it involved everybody, it involved millions of people signing petitions, boycotting the consumption of sugar in their tea, and so all this kind of thing. It was such a big political movement that nobody ever talks about it. It's almost completely hidden. You don't see it on TV, you don't see it in books, it's not taught in schools. Well, how is that possible? How is it possible that the biggest mass political movement in Britain's history is completely ignored? And the answer is because it was a movement of workers, of women, of Africans. It's not considered an important or significant history. But of course, it's vital that we understand that because it tells us something very important about history in general and the history of this country in particular. There are often people making complaints that we're not patriotic enough. Well, in order to be patriotic, you have to have something to be patriotic about. And it's those things which people should be proud of, which are hidden. And those things which are great crimes, which are committed against people, which are highlighted as things that people should be patriotic about, and so on. So actually understanding the history of this country and its connection with Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the world is just a vital means of understanding the world in which we live, and also how the world in which we live came about and how that world can be changed. It shows that human beings are the agents of change. And if those human beings are organized appropriately, then all sorts of things can be are possible. So I think it's very, very important. And as I say, to provide the means for young people in particular to understand this history, but all people to understand it, is something that we can all be involved in but in different ways.
Well, thank you for that. I'll open up to the floor, and I see David, your hand was up first. So David Horsley, could you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Well, first of all, I was so pleased when CLS had invited Hakim to speak. It's very important. And thanks for that, and thanks to you, Hakim. I don't know if you remember Hakim.
I do remember you. How could I forget you?
Well, we corresponded some years ago.
We did.
Concerning, I'd written 10.
We did, and we met as well.
We met at the British Library.
There you go, you see.
And I just want to take the opportunity to say thanks. We met. You were very generous and kind because I asked you questions, you answered. Not everybody does, you know. Some people are quite awkward about that. So thanks for that. I want to promote one. By the way, the books you've written for children are probably the most important in many ways. That's what I think. I'm an old primary school teacher myself. And although I didn't write books then, the lessons I did with a colleague that some of you might have heard of, Beverly Bryan.
Mm-hmm.
That was at Santley Primary School in Brixton between 1968 and 72. I moved on to Kennington and Jamaica and other places after that. But Hakim, the other book that I think is quite unique and an exceptional book, a history book, is Pan-Africanism and Communism.
You're a wonderful man.
Subtitled The Communist International, Africa and the Diaspora, 1919 to 1939. It's a very important book, I think.
Thank you. Well, funny you should say that. It's about to be republished in about 2 weeks' time.
Excellent. But just again to say thanks. All good memories, Hakim. Thank you.
And likewise, thank you so much for your very kind words. Thank you.
Could you give the name of that book again? You were breaking up slightly.
It looks like that. It's going to come out with a different cover. It's called Pan-Africanism and Communism. It'll be published by 1804 Books in New York, but it should be widely available by the end of May. The cover picture here is actually a photo from Cardiff, but it will have a different cover photo when it comes out in 2 weeks' time, or whatever, the end of May.
Yeah, Cover Dizinga, you're next. Could you unmute and ask your question?
Oh, greetings, everyone, and thank you. Greetings, Brother Hakim Adi.
How you doing?
I'm great, thanks. I can see how Europe underdeveloped Africa in the corner there.
Can you?
But I can, yeah, there it is. Look. But anyway, what I wanted to say, I mean, my influence in terms of becoming a Pan-Africanist and so on was shaped by the Black Panthers, for one, people like Muhammad Ali and his work, songs like Young, Gifted and Black, the brothers at the Olympics in the 60s when they gave the Black Power salute and were turfed out of the Olympic Village. But what I think is really important is for all of us collectively to be bringing information into our homes, into our extended families. There are masses of books now in when you go to community events, there's all sorts of books on African history sold by people like Brother Emmanuel, Brother Pepperkai. I mean, I started my political journey at Head Start at 25 West Green Road in Tottenham, where we were introduced to so many scholars internationally.
Someone's got their mic on. Sounds like. Go ahead, Nzinga. I can hear you. Oh, she's
Okay.
a mic on.
She's muted.
Nzinga,
Yes.
can you unmute? Sorry, I muted you, unfortunately, when I was trying to get rid of the other one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. I've been speaking and not knowing it. I can remember when I was doing a degree at the University of Westminster, and I was quoting people like Diop, Walter Rodney, Chancellor Williams, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I was told that this was totally incorrect information and that I was allowing new information to cloud my thinking and my judgment. My judgment wasn't being clouded. I wanted them to know that we had this kind of information. So as I say, my main point is that we must take charge of what our people know. They're not going to get it in the schools. So the Saturday schools are out there doing a good job, and it's for all of us to support these things and promote them. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is that the whole issue of history is one of struggle. It's not just that history is about struggle, but there is a struggle for history, how it's presented, how it's taught, and the powers that be do their utmost to either deny the facts of history or distort the facts of history. And so it's very important that we struggle on all fronts. As I said earlier, it's everybody's history. The history of Africa is everybody's history. It's not just the history of one particular group of people. So it's important that everybody knows that history, everybody has access to it. And so for that reason, we have to fight everywhere, as I say, in libraries, in museums, in schools, and so on and so forth, as well as establishing our own ways of presenting this history. Supplementary schools, setting up our own, whatever, our own ways of presenting history. That's also very important. So it's doing all of these things, whatever it's possible for us to do, I think that's important.
Thank you for that. Joseph, I see you're up next. Could you unmute?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Hakim. I'm feeling very elated, almost in the sky this morning. And good afternoon to you. I want to ask you about two authors, two people that I think have contributed enormously to the education process, or the sort of widening the scope of how people understand what happens in Europe and in Britain in particular. The first name is the latter, which is Olivetti Otele.
Mm-hmm.
He's at the University of Bristol. She wrote a book, Africa and European, where she recounted the contribution of Africans, not just in modern time, but even before we think the arrival of Africans, the main, from the 60s or from, the colonial time. Have you read her book? And the role of Bonnet Code in terms of opening the eyes of people in England to see how the West Indian child was being, and working class was being being made no subnormal. Can you speak to that? And of course, there's a comeback for Bonnet Code's book in the UK and other places now, because people are really referring to that book. In fact, they're writing about the book now. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are many historians, many books that have played a key role. I mean, Nzinga mentioned the work of Walter Rodney, which was and remains very influential. Obviously, the works of Sheikh Anta Diop, then, as you say, more recently, there are others like Olivet and so on. Another very important historian as far as Britain was concerned is my late friend and colleague, Marika Sherwood, who, although not a trained historian, wrote extensively on the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain, as well as on the history of Africa. Her last book was on Nkrumah and the impact of the Cold War in Africa. She also wrote on the history of Pan-Africanism, going back to the first Pan-African Conference, Henry Sylvester Williams, Alice Kinloch and others. We wrote together on the Manchester Pan-African Congress and on key figures in Pan-African history. So there are many books and writers who are very, very important. I think the other thing that needs to be said is that we need to be mindful that we can all be historians in the sense that many of us have lived a reasonably long time. We all have histories to tell about our experiences and so on. I wonder how many of us make efforts to convey that history to young people, to record that history, to make sure that those materials, those pamphlets, those newspapers, which are historically significant, that we have in our attics or we're about to throw away, that they are archived appropriately. How many of us support the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton and make sure that material is collected there and so on. So there are all kinds of ways in which we can contribute to the presentation of history through our own life experience, through our own work, through our own struggle, as well as, making people familiar with particular favorite authors that we have. We all have favorite authors, favorite historians. And so, yes, there are many ways that we can contribute. And I think particularly bringing this information to young people, people like, for example, just to go back on the point I was making, you were making about Bernard Cord's book, which was written, this is almost like prehistoric times for young people who are born in the 21st century. To be talking about the 1970s or 1960s is ancient history. So it's a responsibility of elders to try and convey this history, to find ways of encouraging young people to be interested in all this kind of thing. So lots of work to be done. Frank, you're muted. I think you're speaking, but you're muted.
Yeah, I just fell out, but I've just come back in again. I've noticed that my order has changed. Addis Lennis, you're supposed to be next. So please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Can hear you very well, Addis. How are you doing?
Okay. Hello, good afternoon here in London. Professor Adi, thank you so much for your excellent presentation and the rest of the colleagues. I want to make some comments before the a question. Maybe you to talk about it in your presentation, but maybe it's important for us to say more about the roots in the Caribbean and Latin American experiences. If I might add a brief reflection on Cuba's current context regarding this theme, despite facing the most severe and prolonged economic blockade in our history, a policy that actively targets our educational, academic, and cultural institutions, Cuba remains us fiercely committed to preserve and teaching our sharing African heritage. Our solidarity with Africa and the diaspora is not merely a chapter in a historic book. It's a living, breathing part of our national identity. Maybe the professor Hakim Adi can talk more about it for his visit there in Cuba and his interchange with academics in Cuba. The current economic search attempt to isolate us stifle our capacity for international exchange, but it will not erase our narrative of anti-imperialism solidarity. Space like this webinar are essential to ensure that interconnected strongholds and shared history of the Caribbean, Africa, and the global diaspora continue to be told, understood, and defended. Maybe you can say more how we can be better, included the Caribbean and Latin American experience when teaching the history of the African diaspora here in UK, Professor?
Thank you. Thank you for your question and some very important points there. Well, what can we say? That's of course the history of Cuba, as well as the history of the Caribbean generally, the history of Latin America is very, very important to the history of the African diaspora. I mean, the connection between the two. But I think it's worth saying that the history of Cuba, particularly the history of Cuba since 1959, is such an important history, not just for the Caribbean, not just for Latin America, but for the world in general. And Cuba's efforts to chart its own course, to make its own history, to put the people at the center of history in the sense that they are the decision makers, is kind of unparalleled in that part of the world and in the world in general. And as you rightly point out, it's that striving of the Cuban people to make their own history, to be the decision makers in their own country, which has driven fear into the hearts of the governing circles in the United States as well as their allies. And it's for that reason that the US has so savagely attacked Cuba throughout the last, whatever it is, 60 something over, anyway.
The
70 years.
Yeah.
nearly 70 years. And as everybody knows, that attack has intensified under the current regime in the US. So I think for people to be aware of that history, and to do all they can to support the people of Cuba as history makers is, a kind of responsibility or duty that we all have. It's very, very important. I keep saying that history, or understanding history, helps us understand the world in which we live, but it also means that we recognize that we can all be makers of history, that we are the agents of change. It's we who are powerful. And as I mentioned before, the regime, the actions of the US regime indicate its weakness, its fear, its fear that not just in Cuba, but in the US too, that sooner or later the people will empower themselves and become decision makers and so on. So I think that, as I said, it's crucial, especially at the current time, that we do everything we can to enlighten people about the situation in Cuba, enlighten people about the undeclared war which the US regime has unleashed and is intensifying. It's particularly important for me, I could say, because Cuba has been very good to me. David mentioned Pan-Africanism and Communism earlier. That book was translated into Spanish in Cuba some years ago. The Casa de las Americas has also translated Pan-Africanism, a History, a couple of years ago, so that's now available in Spanish. And we're currently working, I said earlier that I'm very keen on making history available for young people. So I'm currently working on turning a book on Nelson Mandela. We're working on it at the moment. It's been translated into Spanish, and there will soon be a Cuban edition of that children's book for all the children in Cuba. So that history is available to them. And that also illustrates something about Cuba, that it's interested in its population being informed, being educated, being enlightened about the world, about Africa and the diaspora, about Pan-Africanism, about the lives of important African figures and so on. And it highlights the nature of the education system in Cuba, the fact that it's people-centered, that it's concerned with the well-being of its young people, just as we all know about the health system in Cuba, that again, which is people-centered. And in fact, the health system in Cuba is not just people-centered in terms of the Cuban population, but actually exports doctors, exports medical care around the world and so on. So for that reason too, it's really a unique country. Even if it wasn't in the Caribbean, wherever it was, it would still have that unique quality, that unique character. And I think it's so important to expose what is going on, to support in any ways we can the struggle of the Cuban people, which is really our struggle. It's our struggle because every people should be able to determine their own affairs. Every people should be able to make their own decisions. The fact that we don't have that right in Britain is all the more reason why we should support those who do, and we should oppose those who are trying to stop people enjoying those rights. So I'm very grateful to Addis for making those comments, and I think it's a very important question. Of course, I could go on and talk about Cuban history, which is also fascinating, but I won't do that now, because I think the history that Cuba is making at the present time in very difficult circumstances is quite enough to be thinking about, and as I say, doing everything we can to help and to support.
Good
Thank
morning.
you, Professor.
Good morning, Professor. I know you're coming to an end, and I just wanted to ask a quick.
The next in line is Roberta Kilkenny. Roberta Kilkenny, could you unmute and ask the question? But could you shorten it a bit now, because we have got the other speakers is here, and we've still got 6 others after you, Roberta. So
sorry, Frank, can I say, can you hear me? This High Chief Prince had his hand up from ages ago.
Yeah, but it somehow dropped out and came back again.
I see. So, okay. No worries.
I will get to him sooner or later. We'll get there. Okay. Roberta, and then I think it's on this case it's High Chief after.
Thank you, Chair. It's Stephen. I'm having problems logging on, so I'm using our Roberta's phone. Greetings, everyone. Professor Addy.
Sir.
One of the, I was doing African studies. I'm not an educator, like certified educator, but about 30 years or so ago, I started doing some African studies in Brooklyn, New York, with children ranging from age 6 to 17. And with my limited knowledge, the way I presented African studies, I'm talking about Ethiopia, Kemet, Abyssinia, that whole era where it comes with the building of the pyramids, the Sphinx, going back to people like Imhotep and so forth. And one of the first things I did when I entered the class was turn to the back of the class, observe children throwing spitballs, and as soon as one young man got up to throw the spitball, I yelled out, "Freeze!" So naturally, they was so accustomed playing freeze that everybody froze. And here's this young man frozen throwing a spitball. And I used that as a way to respectfully discipline him. And then when I really started teaching about African history, they wanted to know, well, why am I going so far back? Because their knowledge started with the enslavement of the African people. And they couldn't believe that Africa included Ethiopia, Egypt, and all these other places. And they kept asking me to come back every year because the grades of the children improved. They started making the dean's list, perfect attendance. One young man actually who was autistic actually ended up being the spelling bee king in his school. And the rapport that I had with them when we went out when it was time for lunch, sometimes they wouldn't eat the food there. They'd ask me to go to the store with them. And we talk about all kinds of stuff. And when the parents met me, they couldn't believe that I was the one who actually was responsible for changing their children's attitudes, like going out and making groceries, asking for the grocery list, doing the laundry without having to be told, keeping their rooms clean, and all these kind of things. And I'd just like to end with this. Are you familiar with PLO Lumumba? Because he is one of the newly arrived African historians who I have a great deal of respect for. And I could go on, but I'll end it. Thank you, Chair, for recognizing me.
Yes. The fact is not that the kids don't want to learn. It is just that they're not being, taught it. They're not. It's the curriculum. It doesn't include it. Okay. Have you got something to say to that, Professor? Or is that...
No. I don't think that requires anything for me to say anything.
Yeah. Okay. So it's the High Priest, Prince Dr. Walton McLeod. It's your floor now. Could you?
Yeah. Hi there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So it took me 13 universities. Maybe I need to do 30 more universities, but we have a lot of brain power on the call, and thanks to Professor Adi. And I'm a product of UCL. I finished in 2001. And again, it's one of the 13 universities attended. Now, this is not a competition with smarts, but what I've seen in my lifetime, 51 years old, is I don't even know what to make of the world, because I'm in Burkina Faso right now. I'm the CEO for the biggest Pan-African group, ADDI. And we spent 2 weeks, this is the third visit to Burkina, and we are covering the Sahel. I'm also on the Leadership Institute, Nelson Mandela's grandson, and I spoke in Kenya at least twice. I have my own TV program, and it's the #1 show in Cayman, GTR, Genesis Timeline Roots. It's not about accolades, but what I've seen and discovered through spending over $1 million in DNA testing in private labs is that I'm a McDonald, not the Mickey D's and what you see on the street corner. I'm a McDonald. I have met my oldest relative, DaCosta. He's 109. When you do meet someone who's 109 with all his marbles, you need to stop and respect that man. He's a Black McDonald, and he remembers his grandfather, who is John William, who was born in 1840 in Scotland. I have more than 200 Black relatives. The problem is that people use records or they may use DNA. I use both, and there's no budget. I have $2 billion funds. I fund my own programs. I don't need anyone's permission. I'm a lawyer in 7 countries. I'm a British accountant. I went to university at 14. And so what I could see here is a whitewashing, and my wife is white. She's Polish, but yet she's not Polish. She's from Jewish towns called Zhelehov. They were never bombed. There are no records. And I've been to 130 countries, including Cuba and many others. I have relatives scattered all over. They're all Black, Celtic, McDonald's with no African ties. I'm proud Yoruba. I'm a chief, high chief. I'm a double chief. I'm a prince in Nigeria. I have Yoruba roots, but this is over 1,000 years old. It's confirmed by many tests. There are private labs I use in Germany and Poland. I part own some of these labs. We do our tests, we open graves. We've done a lot of research. What I'm saying is, this is the neo-Pan-African view, not neo-colonialist, but neo-Pan-African view. It is the view of Africa being the grandparents of the world, Europe being melanated Black. As you can see, this painting is not a joke. This painting behind me is my backdrop. It's the Moorish Quadrille. And Moor is a derogatory term. It's a misnomer. You go to Brazil, you eat nuts. You don't call them Brazil nuts because you're in Brazil. Black people were everywhere. Here, 4 countries represented. I know you can't see the whole thing. If you go on Facebook, you'll see Lithuanian, Polish, German, Swedish kings and royals in the year 1706, or rather 706, because they have messed with the timeline and added 1,000 years. I just don't see, my question here for the professor, given what we know now, Dr. Marie Charles, a proper academic, a good academic, she's written 25 books on Black history. She's based in the UK. Her father's from St. Lucia, her mother's Irish. But again, she doesn't call her Irish because even someone like Marcus Garvey was Mac Garvey. He was not even Garvey. He's Mac, means son of Garvey. Like I am son of Donald, MacDonald. How can you have 8% of a single demographic of people who own more than 90% of the planet? How can you have 88% of non-Hispanic whites? How can you regress that? What kind of simple-minded mathematicians are around who cannot regress 8% to give us things like white Jesus, white kings, white princes? How could anyone with any sense, and I don't mean to be condescending, but most people are dumbed down, have not much sense. How can you have this demographic controlling the world and we believe and buy the stories of slave trade, of the whites everywhere? And I have grown a family tree of 1 million. I have done so many DNA tests, beyond 500 tests.
Okay, I didn't hear the last part of that, but yeah, I mean, I think the question is, who are those who are most powerful in the world? So those who are politically powerful, economically powerful, are also often those who historically determine how history is presented. As I mentioned earlier, we had a situation a few years ago where there was a quite blatant attempt to present the history of Britain just as a history of the white men of property. And for a long time, the history of Africa was also presented as a history of the white men of property, because it was said that Africa had no history other than the history of Europeans in Africa and so on. So we live in a world, unfortunately, where Eurocentrism is still dominant, and it affects how history is presented and also how people understand history. And one of the features of Eurocentrism is that the idea that there is only one story, there's only one way of looking at the world, there's only one kind of political system, there's only one kind of economic system, that everything is unchanging, and so on. And any cursory study of history shows us that these things are completely false, that everything is in change, everything is in motion, that there are different ways of looking at the world and the phenomena that exist in it, and so on. And I think that once we grasp that important perspective of the world, and once we also grasp the perspective that history is not made by the few but by the many, that even when we talk about the pyramids as somebody did later, the pyramids were not built by one person or two people or three people, but by hundreds and thousands of people. And history is a little bit like that. History is made by the thousands and millions of people, rather than, as we're told, just by a few individuals. So to me, history is, and the understanding of history is vital for understanding the world, understanding our place in it, but more importantly than just understanding the world is the importance of changing the world, of empowering ourselves, of realizing that the way the world is today, the way that Britain is today, doesn't mean that it's always going to be this way, and that it's within our grasp, within our power to change it, to fashion it, not exactly in any way, but to fashion it in a way in which the people can be at the center of things, the decision makers. And for that reason, I think, as I said earlier, history is such an important subject. Everybody fights over it. The powers that be try to deny it or to distort it, to prevent us understanding these very basic truths about the world. So that's how I would see things.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Hakim. We've got 3 more questions, and these are the last.
May I ask a brief question, please? I have a difficulty raising my hand.
Okay, we'll make it 4, but
Okay,
yeah, coming after Laura Miller. So Candace Chimbari.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Hakim. It's Kandasi Chimbiri.
How are you doing?
I am not doing too badly, thank you. And all the better for having listened to this absolutely wonderful talk. I've enjoyed every word you've said. Thank you.
Very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
So my question for you, so in your talk, you spoke quite a bit about people themselves not throwing away their materials, the things they have in the attic, thinking about getting their own things into archives, sharing their own stories. And I've noticed when I've been doing my research for books that it's really difficult to find this material. And why aren't people writing their own biographies, their own autobiographies, their biographies? And I just wonder, it's hard. I have a bit of an idea, and I think I might know, but I just wondered if you could speak a bit to why you think it is that we ourselves don't do this, because it's really difficult to write history without having the materials.
Well, the main reason we don't do it is because we think we're not important or not important enough. Or we sometimes think that the material that we have is not important or not important enough. And so I think we need to enlighten people more. It goes back to this idea of, as you said, who is important. And we've all, or many of us, been involved in all kinds of events, all kinds of activities, which may or may not be important, but the important thing is that they're recorded, the material that we have is archived, and we have to find ways of encouraging people to do that. The Young Historians Project that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that the young people tend to do is to interview elders, to record elders about various aspects of their lives. Just to give an example, they're currently working on a film history of East London Black Women's Organisation. In the past, they've done histories of Black Liberation Front. They've done histories of African women in this country, particularly in the health service and so on. So we need more work of this kind, where those who wish to be historians, those young people who are interested in these things, can go out, can interview and so on. But I think for all of us, certainly before we throw things away, it's good to, ring the Black Cultural Archives, for example, talk to the archivists, say, have you got this? Have you got that? If they have, then okay, maybe you can get rid of it. But I think that the beginning of it is to think about history and what history is. And it's not about kings and queens and so on. It's about us. It's about people like us. If we have that conception, then we think a little bit differently about what we've got or the experiences that we've had, and maybe a little bit more about how we can archive them or share them with others. Of course, archives also have a responsibility. Archivists have a responsibility to go out to people, to make their facilities more well known, to encourage people to preserve things, and so on and so forth. So it's just all part of the work that we have to do. And so you, as a historian and a person who understands these questions, then you have an even greater responsibility to find ways of doing these things, because where there is understanding, then there needs to be action. Where there is ignorance, we can't apportion any blame. But for those who are enlightened, then there's a special duty and responsibility. So, but I'm sure you're doing all you can, and we've got quite a lot of people here, and hopefully they will be encouraged to do the right thing too.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
That's welcome.
Rapidly moving on to Khadija. George, could you unmute and take the floor?
Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm in the US at the moment, but I'd just like to thank. It's just great being amongst such esteemed company on the chat. So thank you, everybody, and thank you very much, Professor Addy. And I just wanted to make it aware, as I did put it in the chat, but I'm making it aware orally as well, that as part of one of the organizations that I work with, Mboka Festival, and Mboka in Wolof means oneness, one Africa, basically, as a very simple term. We've started a Pan-African history course online for young people. It's free. The slight issue in the UK is the whole thing around safeguarding. So, I mean, parents can be part of that group as well if they have a young person who's like under the age of 18, because we really want to get this out to young people, and we encourage them to share whatever information they have with their peers. Because like we say, that's who we're reaching out to, is the young people, to share this information. And we were really pleased that Professor Addy did a guest lecture with our small group earlier on, I think it was earlier on this year. And we are going to do the course again in the autumn, and it's been funded by the United Family and Friends campaign. So it's myself and Isis Amlak, well, mainly Isis Amlak, who does a lot of it, but it's really important for then the young people to even meet an African professor. They need to know that there are African professors around. And so that's why we were really pleased that he did this with us. And it's open to young people internationally. So please, once you come off the call, please pass our contact on to a young person in your family or a parent who you know you've got young people, to encourage them to join this course. It's only for about 6 weeks. So, and we try and do it at a time when it's convenient for most, but we'll also record it. So yeah, so mbokaeducation@gmail.com. Please get in contact with us. Please spread the word. If you've been really motivated by this talk. Thank you very much, Professor Addy. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Very good work.
We're trying.
Thank you, Laura, could you unmute and ask your question or make a contribution?
Yes, thank you. Khadija, I'm sorry, could you repeat the address of the course, please? Because
Yes, and I'll put it in the chat again as well. Mboka, M for mother, BOKA, education @gmail.com.
thank you.
We'll follow up. And yes, Professor Addy will ask you to do it again if you don't mind.
No problem. Yeah, no problem. Just let me know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Addy. It's been a very an extremely interesting talk. For me in particular, I was a history and English teacher for 45 years. Some of us are actually old enough to remember the 50s, forget the 70s, right? So I'm sure it's not all of us, but it's certainly some of us. When I used to teach history, the first thing I would do, I was teaching, this was a period of time when I was teaching in New York. And the first thing I would say to students is, I want you to interview the oldest person in your family and ask them what they were doing when they were your age. Now, almost all the schools that I worked in were Black and Hispanic. And so kids would come back with different things. One of the young people said to me, well, my sister's 24. Can I ask her? And I said, no, it's not old enough. Do you have a grandmother? Yes, she lives in Virginia. I said, fine, there's this wonderful new invention called a telephone. Why don't you phone her and ask her? And the following day, this kid came in and said, you know what my grandmother was doing? She was standing on civil rights lines and getting harassed by police dogs when she was my age. And I always thought that was, it got the kids at least interested in what history actually was. But one of the difficulties I discovered, and this was the question I had for you, was that when I went into teacher training for several years, I discovered that the textbooks that were used were different depending on the state. And so the history that young people were taught was actually different. And I mean, specifically from the Civil War onwards, was very different in the South than it was in the North. I wondered if you, when you were teaching in England, I taught in England as well, but I was mainly teaching young people who were apprentices who would come back to school one day a week to learn. Mainly they were learning learning how to read and write, which a lot of these kids didn't know at that time. Whether in your looking at secondary schools, whether there is this, who do the kids use? I mean, I tutor for GCSEs now, and I have two goddaughters who are Congolese, but who know nothing about the history of Congo. I wondered if, in your view, there was anything that anybody could do to watch what's coming into schools for the kids to learn or to learn from, and whether there is any way of suggesting to publishers, because I don't actually know whether secondary schools use textbooks. They do in most of the states in New York. And in New York is particularly good. And when we were teaching Black history and African history when I was there. All right, Frank. Okay. So that was my question.
Yeah, it's a important question. So it's a difficult one to answer quickly because the situation has changed over the last few years. We used to talk a lot about national curriculum in schools. Now, a lot of schools, probably the majority of schools, are academies.
Mm.
Academies don't have to follow the national curriculum. They can make up their own curricula, generally speaking. And so it becomes more difficult to, you could say, intervene in schools in general. It becomes much more an individual question. Years ago, we used to, myself and Marika Sherwood and others, we used to try and talk to publishers about the kind of books that are published. And then the publishers would say, well, it depends what's in the curriculum and so on. So you get all these sort of circular arguments. I think the key thing is for, and if we look at what's going on in the US now with the question of books, we can see how important this question is, that it's really up to everybody, up to parents in particular, grandparents, as I said earlier, those of us who have access to libraries, to make sure that the widest selection of books is available. You know, books which are about Africa, about the Caribbean, about African and Caribbean people in Britain, about women, about everything. The situation in the US, I think, is worth just mentioning briefly. If people haven't seen it, I would recommend the documentary on iPlayer. I think it's called The Librarians. It's about the struggle in the US over books. And in many places, the US education system is a bit different from ours, but it's not so different. In many places, school boards have been taken over by by what would you call them? Fascists, really, I suppose, is what you'd call them. And so they now determine which books can be used in schools. One of the things that is quite interesting about their kind of means of attack, that they seem to attack books on sexuality first. So first they attack anything to do with LGBTQ plus, etc., etc. And that's their way in. Then they attack books about Black people. Then they attack, and so it's like a well-developed tactic. You attack one section of the people first, and then you use that attack to attack everybody. And so then you get to the issue of the importance of defending the rights of all. And I always like to go back to the 18th century for my example of this. And if you know anything about the 18th century struggle for the rights of people, you'll know that a very important guy was a guy called Thomas Hardy, who was the secretary of the London Corresponding Society, which was an early workers' organization which was banned by the government. And he was a friend of Olaudah Equiano, who some of you will have heard of. And Thomas Hardy wrote to a friend of Equiano's, and he said to him, I understand that you are a friend of the oppressed Africans. I take it from that you're also a friend to the oppressed in general, because anybody who is a friend of oppressed Black people must also be a friend of oppressed white people and vice versa. So this was in the 18th century. In the 18th century, they understood that you had to defend the rights of all. And in the 21st century, we should also understand that we have to defend everybody's rights. And when we defend everybody's rights, we're strong and powerful. But if we only defend the rights of one section, then it's very easy to create divisions and to do what they're doing in the US. So perhaps I'll finish on that note, the importance of defending the rights of all.
Yeah. I want to ask a quick question, though. Can I come now?
Questions. I think it is your turn now, Thompson. So,
all right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry I missed a lot of the lecture because I logged in a bit late. I just wanted to ask a quick question in the context of the current situation in the Middle East now, especially with Iran. I read a clip a few days ago indicating that there is a sizable African diaspora in southern Iran, and in fact, the 1979 Iranian Revolution was in large part influenced by the work of Frantz Fanon from Martinique. It was the first time I was reading this, so I just wanted to actually ask the professor whether he's aware of that, and to what extent do you believe that the African diaspora in Iran is still very active in the politics of Iran? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. There is an African diaspora in Iran, as there is in Iraq, as there is in many countries in that region. About their political activities today or at the time of the Iranian Revolution, I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. So,
okay, thank you. Yeah.
Dennis, you have the floor.
Okay, Professor, thank you very, very much for what has been an interesting and educational meeting. You say, and I've written it down, history is not made by the few, but the many. And I think that is so important. And history now is even more important than previously, as the Trump administration has learned. My question is this. White working class brothers and sisters in the UK and elsewhere have been, in my opinion, inoculated against their own history by the worship of effectively rich white men, which has caused, from my observation, a bit of resentment, or considerable bit of resentment. Is there a danger within the African community of us falling into the worship of great, rich Black men and a minority of Black women, such as Musa Mensa and Zinga, and so on? You've highlighted this as a danger from what I'm hearing. How do we study, read, and teach history for all?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Very good question. And good examples as well. I think there are a number of ways of answering this question. And it's one that I'm actually grappling with at the moment because I'm writing a history of Africa at the present time. The question is, I suppose, why do we remember Mansa Musa? And there are probably three reasons why we remember Mansa Musa that I can immediately think of. One is because he appears on a 14th century early European map. So we actually see a pictorial representation of him. Secondly, we remember him because there are written records about him, both internal, we can say, records within the area of historic Mali, but also records from Egypt and other places, and records of the Arabic-speaking and writing geographers of that period. And the third reason we remember Mansa Musa, for those who don't know who Mansa Musa was, he was an emperor of Mali in West Africa. The third reason, medieval Mali. The third reason why we remember Mansa Musa is because he was reputedly the richest man in the world, or described as the richest man in the world. So for all of those reasons, the figure of Mansa Musa refutes the idea that Africa had no history. It refutes the idea that Africans were incapable of ruling themselves. It refutes the idea that Africa was poor before the colonial period, and so on and so forth. And historically, just affirming all of those things, and there are probably other things about him that one could say, is very, very important. And today, probably many people have heard of Mansa Musa, and they maybe haven't heard of the other emperors of that empire and so on. If we actually look into what we know about Mansa Musa, what's reported about him, first is that he, took so much gold with him on his pilgrimage to Mecca that when he stopped in Cairo, the value of gold on the international bullion markets of that day plummeted and didn't recover for many years later and so on. But if we actually look at the reports of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage or know anything about that empire, the first thing about an empire is it suggests that there are some people who rule and there are other people who ruled and who were ruled, sorry. In other words, that there was inequality which existed at that period. And in fact, we know several things about Mansa Musa. One is that he wasn't responsible for mining the gold that he took with him. That was produced by others. That he took with him, by some reports, hundreds, if not thousands, of enslaved people during that period and so on. So if we wanted to have a balanced view of the history of medieval Mali, we would have to take all those things into consideration. What kind of state it was, who ruled it, who were the ruled, what was the nature of inequality, how was the wealth produced, how was it taken by the kings and the wealthy, and so on and so forth. And similarly, if we look at Nzinga or Njinga, who was a queen of the kingdom of Ndongo in what is today Angola, in the period 17th century, the period when that particular kingdom was coming under attack by the Portuguese, where thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were being enslaved and trafficked across the Atlantic. One of the key things that we know about Njinga was that she kind of fought a resistance war against the Portuguese, also against the Dutch to some extent during that period, and so on. And because she's included in many Portuguese and other records of that time, we know something about her, just as we know something about the other kings of the Congo and Dongo and other kingdoms in that region. And that's important. There was a queen. The queen fought against an anti-colonial struggle. She united the kingdom of Ndongo against the Portuguese. She fought a war of liberation for many, many years and so on. That's very, very important. If we actually look into what was the nature of the kingdom, how did she operate, etc., we'll find out all sorts of other things. That yes, inequality existed. Yes, there were enslaved people. Yes, this, all these kinds of things. So we have to, in our presentation, the history of Africa, we have to understand, if we like, both of these aspects. Yes, there were rulers who fought and who united people. Yes, these kingdoms were, there was inequality. There were some people who were wealthy and some people who were poor and so on. We know more about the history of the wealthy generally than about those who were poor or enslaved, although sometimes the enslaved also get into the kind of historic record and so on. So we have to have a kind of all-round view of this history. Why are different aspects of it important? What lessons we need to kind of draw from it and learn from it. And anyway, hopefully that's the kind of history that I'm going to write. You'll be able to judge yourself in a couple of years' time. So yeah, it's an important question, an important point. We can't obscure or deny things which are a bit unpalatable or which fly in the face of the idea that before the period of European interference in Africa, everything was fine, everybody was happy, everybody loved everybody else. This is obviously, it's not true. If we go back to the history of ancient Egypt, clearly there were wealthy people, there were poor people, there were people who were enslaved, there were you know, that this was a society which was hierarchical, where there was inequality and so on. So what is it that we want to understand about it? Did it produce great monuments? Did it produce great art? Did it produce great science? Yes, it did. But it produced these on the back of those who produce the food to feed those who were sitting around, whatever they were doing, designing pyramids or building pyramids, because they had to be fed as well. So yes, it's important that we understand history in its entirety, and that we can draw the appropriate lessons from it.
Yes, thank you for that, Professor. It's a very, very good question. If we've got to learn our history, we've got to learn the hidden parts as well, the parts we not. Our next speaker has disappeared, so I will take another question. There's Marcia Nurse, and there were two people I knocked off if they want to come back with some short questions, because we are running out of time. We've had a good yes, Wilhelmina, and there was Wilhelmina and someone else. Anyway, Marcia, could you take the floor and ask the question?
Yes, hello to everyone, and I'd like to particularly thank Professor Addy for his very balanced view just now when we are recounting the history of iconic persons, either, and in this case, he was discussing persons in Africa. What I'm hearing from the contributors this morning made me think that one of the key areas is to, in our education outreach to young people and even adults, is to allow people to move towards identifying themselves within the pages of history. And to do that, they need to conduct deep genealogy research, and as mentioned before, DNA research also helps with that identity. And in doing that, I believe that it will raise some of the consciousness that we need in young people to appreciate the history. And we're speaking particularly of young people of color, whether they're born in United Kingdom, in other European countries, or in the West Indies. That type of research will allow them to make a personal identification with particular countries in Africa. The other point I thought was very, it hit me very hard, was the importance of not denying the history and not distorting it. My experience is I am not a historian with all of these letters, PhD. I'm not a professor. I am an individual who has done extensive research, one into my own family genealogy and how we acquired certain surnames. And secondly, and that took me back into the late 1700s. And secondly, I continue to read a lot of historical publications in order to educate myself on a broad level, not only published by Barbadian and West Indian historians, but by historians in Europe and in the United States. And what I would say is that we have to be conscious that in moving our people towards Africa, we ensure that the research is conducted to offer the archival proof, or to offer us the ability to do the analytical investigation of the archival document to reveal iconic figures of worth. I have a challenge. I live in Barbados, and I have a challenge, and it feeds into what Professor Addy just said. we have, for instance, an iconic figure on the landscape whose name has become a national hero. But if one examines the archival data, one sees that there's absolutely no source document that indicates this person conducted the actions that they allegedly are supposed to have conducted under the writings of the historian Beckles. And I believe that this is a serious matter. And in order to move our people to Africa, we need not create a person. We need not make that person African when there's no archival research to support same. We need to look at that person within the context. If that person's name is in history, we need to examine that person in the context of what is on the archival document and perhaps why the colonial authorities included them, not in a leadership position, but just included them in general. And these are important. The importance of research and even researching information that has been put out there by acclaimed persons is extremely important in us teaching young people and nations of people to begin to identify, one, with iconic figures, and two, with various countries within the continent of Africa on a personal level.
Which historic figure are you talking about?
I just wanted to make that contribution because the information I heard this morning from various people, including Professor Addy in his last contribution, certainly supports that we must, yes, identify with Africa. We must draw our people towards Africa, but in doing so, we must ensure that we look at all levels of the personalities and all levels of the history.
But Marcia, which historic figure are you referring to?
In the context of no archival sources to support same, is that who you mean, sir?
Yes. Who are you talking about?
The iconic figure that has been disseminated globally is the figure of a African-born man called Busa, who led a rebellion in the country of Barbados.
Okay.
And I think that has to be re-examined.
Okay. But also what needs to be examined is Busa didn't organize that on his own. There were several people who were involved in organizing that rebellion, and they all need to be seen as being equally important, whether they were African born or not. I think the problem in the, if I may say so, in the Bajan situation is more how history is situated, so we put it like that, because there's a more general problem, in fact, not just in Barbados, but throughout the Caribbean, of how history is taught or not taught in schools, how young people are educated about history. And I always find it rather strange that you have a country like Barbados that its government makes a big fuss about reparations, but it's not repairing its own population by allowing them to discover and uncover their own histories. So that seems to me to be a wider problem about how history is presented, how it's researched, how it's developed more generally. And I think obviously the more people like yourself who are involved in discussing, researching history and in understanding all those who played prominent roles historically, the better Barbados, as well as many other countries in the Caribbean, will be. So without going into, anyway, Hilary Beckles is not the only person who's written about Busa, but anyway, I think there's all I'm saying is I think there's much more room for a national discussion about these figures. And that national discussion must be from an enlightened perspective of everybody being in a much better position to understand the history, to study the history, to involve themselves in the history, and for the country as a whole to present this history more broadly. Because you go throughout Barbados, it's actually quite difficult to see evidence of history apart from a great big statue of Bussa, but that's much more could be done.